I was bitten by the magic bug back in the 50s. I was, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old. I wasted the first 7 years of my life. And I used to watch the Ed Sullivan Show and occasionally see magicians and just found them absolutely riveting. My grandmother would take me into Boston. I lived in the suburbs, and we'd go sometimes to the joke shop, and I was always drawn to the magic counter. And for a shy kid, magic was a great vehicle to get outside one's shell, and I certainly suggest it to anyone sitting here or your children or your grandchildren. It's really done so much for me in my life in many ways. So I'm here today because having been bitten by the magic bug, and also apparently I'm one of those people who's also, my wife says I'm a hoarder. I prefer the word collector. I'm wondering how many of you consider yourself collectors of something? Any of you? Huh? What do you collect?
Books.
I saw a hand over here.
Houdini.
You collect Houdini?
Some, yeah.
Really? We'll have to talk later. Okay. Who else? Any other?
I have a magic collection that she wonders what she'll have to do with.
Really? Okay. Well, we'll definitely talk. So I guess a lot of collectors eventually become dealers, right? You've heard that. So I have a website, magicposters.com. That's not why I'm doing this today. It's not a commercial, but if you're interested in magic, you might enjoy just looking at the site. Actually,
as well?
I sure do. In fact, for me, the site attracts things. To my wife, yeah, I sell stuff once in a while. But anyway, hopefully she won't watch the video that JD is making. So magic is really a passion for me. I haven't quit my day job as a trial lawyer, but I think in many ways it's enhanced my ability to do my job. But that's another topic. But I've been an amateur magician since childhood and a student of magic history, and as JD said, since the 80s, collector. I collect not just magic posters, but definitely Houdini material, because Houdini really is just such an amazing individual, such an incredible person. What a character. You'd think he was made up, except he was actually a real person. And it's extraordinary. I woke up this morning, and what's the first thing you do? You know, you look at your cell phone, right? Which is kind of pathetic. But in my case, I went to the computer. My wife was looking at the Washington Post online, and what is the headline in today's Washington Post? At least when I woke up, it was, Israel's Netanyahu, a political Houdini, is facing his toughest escape act yet. So here it is, almost 90 years since Harry Houdini passed away, and he still is being invoked, in headlines, and people don't have to ask what being a Houdini is. Everyone knows what being a Houdini is. So I just thought that was sort of interesting. Maybe it was the spirits at work on my computer. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one who had this morning. But I just thought that was worth sharing.
Today's post?
It was this morning's post. But on the e-edition, it changes from hour to hour, so it's probably gone. But you might be able to find it. Anyway, so let me upgrade my glasses here. So what I'm going to do today is share some items from my collection. So those of you who are collectors hopefully will enjoy it, and those of you who aren't probably will say, boy, I'm glad I'm not a collector. But hopefully you'll enjoy some of the what I call eye candy, but also material that helps tell the story of the most famous magician of all time. Maybe Merlin might be, but we're not sure he's real. But we know that Harry Houdini was real, and he certainly was one of the first, perhaps the first superstar. And we'll, of course, when JD asked me to do this talk, he asked me to focus on Houdini's relationship to spiritualism and spiritualists. And we're going to do that today. Harry Houdini was born in 1874 as Eric Weiss in Budapest. His father is referred to as a rabbi, but he also was a lawyer. And he left Budapest when Harry was a baby. The family immigrated to America, specifically to Appleton, Wisconsin, where Mayor Samuel Weiss took on a job as rabbi for a small congregation in Appleton, Wisconsin. By the 1890s, Harry had fallen in love with magic and being a magician. A precocious youth, he would tell a story later in life that his mother, to whom he was very close, made such good apple pie that he would always be asking for the pie, and so she would have to, after she gave him a piece, she would have to lock it away in a cabinet. So young Eric learned how to pick the lock of the cabinet in order to get to the pie. Now that may be apocryphal, but it's a good beginning as any for us to discuss Harry Houdini, who would develop, apparently at a young age, a fascination for getting into things and later on getting out of them. Here he is with his mother, Cecilia Steiner Weiss. And as I said, they were very close, and anyone who's read any of the Houdini biographies or seen the Tony Curtis movie or any of the other bioflicks would know about their very close relationship. When his father passed away, Houdini was still relatively young, and his father made him promise that he would take care of his mother, and he certainly lived up to that promise. So his mother was the baker of the apple pies, and he was the apple of her eye. Okay, so by the 1920s, Harry is performing. He's doing magic. He's probably, I'm not sure exactly how old he is in that photograph, but possibly around 20. Over his right shoulder, it's very hard to see, but there is a poster over his right shoulder, and this is the poster, or this is a copy, or this is an example of one of those posters. There's one in the Library of Congress, and there's one in the David Copperfield collection, and one in my collection. He is performing with Bess, who he had recently married, Bess Ronner, and they became the Houdinis. That is, his name was Weiss, but he had read an autobiography of Robert Houdin, the French magician, who really inspired him. And he was told by a friend, if you added an I to the name Houdin, the name was Robert Houdin, but of course he didn't. He thought that the last name was Houdin. Added an I, became Houdini, so he wanted to emulate Robert Houdin, and he took on the name Houdini. So at this stage, he's really quite unknown, and I suppose you could say he was one of the first feminists. His wife has equal billing in the act. They are the Houdinis, Bess and Harry, and they performed this illusion called metamorphosis, where Harry was tied up, put into a bag that was tied at the top. That's put into a trunk. The trunk is then tied up, and then a curtain is raised, and within seemingly seconds, the curtain comes down, and Harry is standing outside the trunk, and the trunk is opened up, etc., and Bess is inside. So they switched. And this is a magic trick. It's really a classic illusion that's still performed today. Doug Henning, you may remember him. He popularized it in the 70s. The Pendragons, another popular group, had a wonderful version of it, or duo, not a group. They aren't together anymore, but there are still certainly people that are performing the metamorphosis. Houdini probably was not the first to perform it with his wife, but certainly it was an effect that they performed that helped them become more well-known, and certainly it probably was the best received of all he was doing. And when he signed up with Martin Beck in the late 1890s, who was a manager also on the rise, he saw something in Houdini, and he said, you know, I'd like you to work with me, and I'll be your manager. And he basically told him to, let's cut out the magic and let's just focus on the metamorphosis and the other escapes that you do, you know, the handcuff escapes, etc. And that really, would, of course, would be a turning point for Houdini. Now, when he performed the metamorphosis, importantly for our discussion today, while he would go on later on to be a debunker of spiritualists, that is, fraudulent spiritualists, and he would be a skeptical crusader, in his early years, he did take advantage, let's say, of a gullible public and would try to sort of weave in spiritualistic themes in some of his tricks, as many magicians do. You know, the traditional magic poster shows a magician with a devil on his shoulder or talking to a devil. That's a very frequent motif that you see in magic posters. So even when he performed the metamorphosis, which he called the ghost box, he would moan, and he would sometimes rap on the inside of the trunk to suggest, even though he was tied up, and this would be seemingly impossible, that maybe there were spirits in there that were helping him out. And when his shows were written up in the press, and sometimes a reporter might opine that perhaps there's something more than just trickery, perhaps there's some sort of work with the supernatural, Houdini didn't exactly go out of his way to disabuse them of those ideas. So he would occasionally use a spiritualistic theme or weave it into his magic. Here's a very early, what's called a cabinet photo of Houdini. This was actually obtained from Bess, not by me directly, but someone else who had it for many years. And this was what they call a spirit photograph, where you see what looks like sort of, it's kind of not that easy to see, but you see near his legs sort of the shroud of a ghost. And of course, that's just a double exposure. But back then, you know, people would look at that and really be blown away. So there he's kind of combining escapes and something with the spirits. And that's very early in his career. This is a book that he published, again, in the late 1890s with a, not exactly the same photo, but probably these were taken at the same sitting, very similar. Here, more clearly, you can see the ghost-like apparition in the photograph. Actually, before he was discovered by Martin Beck, he was not exactly a success. And actually, in this particular book, he's offering to sell his secrets. And you can see that he is versed in the work of spiritualists. You may not be able to read it, maybe some of you can, but it says, for example, for 50 cents, you can learn how to cause an accordion to play music even though tied and sealed up. For $1, how to materialize spirit forms so they rise from the solid floor. And at the bottom, the grand Houdini slate trick, how to get a communication between two slates that have been brought to you sealed and riveted for a private seance. And I like this language for you guys. Without the skeptics, letting them out of their hands. Good effect, secret and full explanations. $5. And that was not cheap. So as you can see, by the late 1890s, he is well versed in the secrets of spiritualists, or at least some spiritualists. In 1911, he sought out Ira Davenport, and this is an early small broadside of the Davenport brothers, and they were from upstate New York, and they would be tied up and put into this cabinet, large cabinet. Doors would be closed, and then all kinds of manifestations would occur, and tambourines would be shaken, and banjos strummed, and objects thrown out, and then the doors would be open, and they'd still be sitting there tied up. So, of course, the suggestion was that there were spirits would come into the cabinet and cause all these manifestations. There were riots at some of the performances of the Davenport brothers. They were extremely popular. They performed all over the U.S. And in Europe. They performed in Russia. But really, they were magicians who kind of took it to an extreme in terms of how they promoted themselves. So this, as you can see, this is from 1868. So in 1911, Ira Davenport was still alive. He was living in upstate New York, where they were from originally. His brother was long gone. And Houdini traveled about 800 miles to meet with him. And they spent some time together. And Houdini and Davenport taught Houdini the Davenport rope tie, which was really the core of their act. That is, a tie, a way that they would be tied so that they could get released, but also get back into the position so it looked as though they had never been released. So this would become part of Houdini's armamentarium, if you will, for the rest of his career. Also, Harry Keller, who was a mentor to Houdini. Harry Keller was the dean of American magicians. Literally, he was the dean of the Society of American Magicians at the turn of the century. He's the person who, the story is, that the Wizard of Oz, that the character of the wizard is based on. It's based on Harry Keller. So he was from Erie, Pennsylvania. His real name was Heinrich Keller, but it was spelled with an E. But the name was too similar to Robert Heller, the magician. So he changed the E to an A. It became Keller. Anyway, that's a little too much inside baseball, unnecessary for this talk. But Keller also had a rope tie, which he probably learned from the Davenports. But there's, to this day, people perform the Keller rope tie, again, which is a method of getting out of the rope and then back into the rope, which he, again, shared with Houdini. And also, again, talking about the theme of spiritualism or spirits, here is a 1905 poster of Houdini, the prison cell and barrel mystery. And of the research I've done, it looks like he only performed it for about a year in the UK. And you can see the theme of the supernatural, the fairies, the little devil imps, and he's kind of levitated above the barrel in a kind of a fog. He also performed, of course, in his career, many escapes, many different kinds of escapes involving straitjackets, handcuffs. You saw that first photo where he refers to himself as Harry Handcuff Houdini. Packing cases. He would arrange to be, quote, challenged. That is, where a local, maybe a shipping department of a store, or a bunch of sailors, or one case, suffragettes, would challenge him to a particular kind of escape. And they would negotiate how it would be done, that is, maybe no ropes around his neck or something like that. And then he would accept the escape. And of course, it would always be he would accept the challenge, and the challenge would always be performed at, Saturday night's Keith's Theater, or whatever the big show was that he was about to do. So that was one way that Houdini packed the theaters. So this is a challenge in England. Chief constable lock you up. So this was escaping from a packing case. And he was challenged by William Finlayson, who is a builder, presumably of packing cases. This would be the 4th of July at the Gaiety Theater. Okay. And here's another one. This is a escape from a burglar-proof safe. This actually was in Houdini's personal collection, and at the very top, he had typed in, very proudly, "I escaped in 14 minutes." He frequently, he left many scrapbooks, and often like that, sort of knowing that some years later, people would be reading them. Other escapes that he performed, he was sewn into the belly of a huge sea monster that had been washed up on a New England beach, a modern-day Jonah. He almost passed out from the chemicals used to preserve the big fish. He escaped from the famous water torture cell. You probably saw that in the Tony Curtis movie of Houdini. He didn't really die in the water torture cell, although he does in the movie. That's not really true. He had a giant milk can that would be filled with water that he escaped from. He was not a drinker, and he almost did not escape from a milk can that had been filled with beer that a brewery had challenged him to escape from. I guess he hadn't really thought that one out really well. So Houdini was also, in addition to being a magician and record-setting escapologist. What did he do in Australia in 1910?
Did you fly?
He was the first person to solo fly a plane in Australia. So he really, and also I believe the name Houdinize, the word Houdinize, maybe he did some lobbying to get it done, but it was in Funk and Wagnall's dictionary. Houdinize, to extricate oneself from an object. Anyway, so that's all, the guy's like the turn of the century, and he's really sort of a superstar. Whenever he was in New York, he would pop in on his mother. They would have tea along with Bess. This is a family photo of the three of them. Harry looks like he couldn't be happier with the two women in his life. He was performing in Germany in 1913 when he received a cable that his mother had died. This was a stunning blow. He immediately fainted. He later cabled back that they should delay the funeral until he had returned so he could see her one more time. Remember, this is in the days of ocean liners. So he went back to the U.S., and here is a letter from Houdini to his good friend Will Goldston, who is a impresario and a British magician, magic shop owner. I am very sick. It will take a couple of months to get me back again. Have canceled my work to end of September. We sail in mourning for America. Can't write much. Am too broken up over my darling mother, H.H. And just to, as if I haven't made my point about their relationship, here is a card that he had printed up after her death. In part, he writes, "The mother to whom eternity means no more than a fleeting, forgotten second of time, when working or watching for her children, you must cherish while she is with you, so that when the pitiless reaper brings from the Almighty the mandate recalling mother, you may receive from your ever-present conscience the consolation coming from the knowledge that you tried to remove the briars from the path which she trod through the mortal valley of the shadow of death." He really should have written greeting cards for Hallmark. But no, seriously, obviously he really had an amazingly close relationship with her, and obviously it was a stunning blow, that loss. So how does he respond? After his father had died in 1892, Houdini had gone to a medium to try to establish contact with his late father, but to no avail. The family also tried to contact Herman, who was one of Houdini's brothers who had died as a child. So on the one hand, he's delved into fake spiritualism. He's used it as a motif in his act. He knows the tricks of spiritualists. He knows that most of them are frauds. But yet he's not totally convinced. And he would say in later years, he would reveal that he had 16 friends as an adult with whom he had a pact that whoever predeceased would try to contact the other. And he said that nearly all of them had died and none of them had been able to contact him. So this sophisticated globe-trotting performer who's well aware of the world of fake mediums, in his grief, nonetheless, seeks to communicate with his beloved mother. So he continues, or should I say starts, to seek out mediums who might offer the possibility of his communicating with his beloved mother. Now, of course, what happens? He goes to various mediums, and each one, he sees what's going on. He knows the trickery. He knows about spirit horns and luminous paint or whatever the methods are that they're using. He sees through every one. And he gradually becomes a crusader against this industry, against fraudulent spiritualists. And keep in mind that the spiritualism movement was in full bore. We're talking about post-World War I. Millions of men had died, so people wanted to communicate with their late husbands and sons. There had been a huge flu epidemic around that time, so even more millions had passed away. Houdini would come to offer an award of $10,000 to anyone who, for 3 times, could perform a spiritualistic phenomenon that Houdini could not himself duplicate or explain. No one ever received that award. One individual who would regret crossing paths with Houdini was a man named Pierre Keeler. He was a medium from Lilydale, New York. Lilydale, New York was a hotbed of psychic mediums at that time. So Houdini found out that Keeler was doing readings there. So he decided to send Bess's niece, a young Julia Sawyer, on a train to Lilydale, New York, to see if she could get a reading from Mr. Keeler. And he told her that he had a message from her sister, although she never had a sister, and that he wanted her to know that her parents were doing just fine in the spirit world, except they were still alive. It sounds like Keeler was not such a great medium, but anyway, so Julia called or cabled Houdini and said and explained what had happened, and Houdini, with the thrill of the hunt, got on the train and went up to Lilydale. And what he did was he actually called a reporter who went up to Lilydale with him, and Houdini donned a disguise as an invalid in a wheelchair, and the reporter was his attendant. So Houdini was purportedly the uncle. Well, he was her uncle, actually. So she said, "This is my invalid uncle." And basically Houdini said to Keeler, ripped off his disguise, as he was wont to do, and said, "You're out of business. I've got you dead to rights." The man appealed for professional courtesy, saying to Houdini, "Wait a minute, we're in the same business." He says, "No, we're not. I'm a legitimate entertainer, and you, sir, are a cheat." So here is a telegram from Syracuse, New York, from the Syracuse Hotel in Houdini's hand. I will read it to you. This was actually written right after this event. Associated Press, New York City. That's actually, it's not the telegram. It's you would write out and then give it to the telegrapher, and then telegrapher, the person who would hit the machine and send the message, and then when it came out, typed up, that's the telegram. Okay, so this is what he signed, and it says, "Just returned from Lilydale, New York, camp of spiritualists. Caught dead to rights, Pierre Keeler, greatest slate-writing medium who for 40 years has been gulling the public. Have documentary evidence, fraud, and in front of witnesses admitted his guilt. This is the most important expose since the birth of spiritualism. Houdini, Syracuse Hotel, Syracuse, New York." The most important expose since the birth of spiritualism, this pathetic guy up in New York. So it sort of does reflect sort of Houdini's very understated nature. He obviously was at all times a showman and a master promoter. Anyway, so another person who was very much involved in the world of spiritualism at the other end of the continuum, that is, not as a deceiver, but as a believer, was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now Doyle, a trained physician and the author, of course, and the creator and author of all the Sherlock Holmes stories, one would think would be extremely rational and logical, since Sherlock Holmes probably was a pretty logical character, logical detective. Doyle found spiritualism extremely appealing to him, both on an intellectual level and perhaps more so emotionally, having lost a son in World War I, with whom he desperately wanted to make contact. It was inevitable, of course, that Conan Doyle and Houdini would meet, and it probably didn't hurt that Houdini sent him a copy of his one of his books, The Unmasking of Robert Houdin. They became friends. By 1922, they were at the Ambassador Hotel at Atlantic City, vacationing, when the British author suggested to his friend that his wife, that is Mrs. Doyle, had a certain gift. This is Harry with what's called a spirit horn, used by spiritualists to make eerie sounds. The horn would usually collapse, like those plastic drinking cups, you know, that collapse. The horn would also collapse, so it could be secreted. So Doyle asked Houdini if he would permit his wife to attempt what was called automatic writing, where the person who did the automatic writing would be would channel a deceased person. Houdini said, "Okay, sure," and they had this séance. So Mrs. Doyle, imagine Mrs. Doyle sitting there with a pencil, with sheets of paper at the table, going into a trance, and eventually she started writing feverishly. She said that she sensed that she was communicating with Mrs. Steiner Weiss. And she asked, "Are you religious?" And she put the sign she made a cross at the top of the paper. And then she started writing in English, "Oh, my son, oh, I'm so happy here. I'm so glad that I could finally make contact with you." And she's going on, and as she's finishing each sheet, Doyle is handing her a blank sheet, and she's filling up sheets and sheets of paper. And most of it is very generic and really nothing specific to Harry or his relationship with his mother. Afterwards, of course, Doyle says, "You see, Houdini, you see what she was able to do." And Houdini, rather than share how he really felt, tried to be tactful about it. Later, in his book, A Magician Among the Spirits, where he recounts this episode and other instances with spiritualism, he writes that the last thing his mother would have done would put a cross on the paper. They were Jewish. His father was a rabbi. Also, she would not have written in English. She didn't speak English. She spoke German or Yiddish. So there was nothing about the experience that suggested to him that there had been any successful contact with his mother. Quite the contrary. But he didn't want to really hurt Doyle's feelings. He wanted to preserve the friendship. However, when he put that in the book, somehow Doyle wasn't happy about that, and they never spoke again. Another person important in the history of Houdini's relationship with spiritualists is a woman from Boston who was married to a surgeon, Dr. Crandon. Her name was? Margery, yes, Mina. Mina Crandon, known as Margery. And she was an attractive, referred to as a flapper in the 1920s. A couple of decades younger than her husband. Not that that matters, but part of the picture. She would invite members of the Scientific American Committee. The Scientific American established a prize, sort of similar to Houdini's challenge, for any spiritualist who could basically fool a committee that they had formed of scientists and others, and Harry Houdini, he was on the committee. So they had gotten wind of Margery, and she was attracted to the prize of $2,500 for a medium who could demonstrate genuine spiritualistic phenomenon. Houdini had, of course, done his homework and studied her modus operandi. So when he went up to Boston, he was going to be part of the seance. And he knew, I don't know, I somehow got this on eBay. This is quite amazing, this photograph. It looks to me like it's legit. And there's Margery, or someone purported to be Margery. And that would be Houdini to her left. And he knew that the husband always sat on the right, or Mr. Byrd. And Malcolm Byrd, was, according to Houdini, sort of on Margery's side. He might not have been totally independent in evaluating her as a spiritualist. But Houdini, of course, being a skeptic, he wanted to make sure that if there was trickery, that he knew about it, or that he figured it out. So since his right leg was going to be in contact with her left leg, he put a very tight bandage around it the day that of the seance, before the seance, so that when he took off the bandage, his leg was very sensitive to the touch. And I guess they must have taken some photographs, since it was Scientific American, to record aspects of the experiment. So that's what this photograph apparently is. And Houdini, sure enough, was able to determine at certain times when she was moving. Even if she wasn't moving that leg, if she was moving, another part of her body, he was able to tell. And there was a point actually, after it all occurred, he would eventually publish a book, a pamphlet, which you can still find on eBay for those who are thinking of collecting magic. And an expose of Margery. Yes? He said, weren't there other members of the committee who thought Margery was completely legitimate? And that is right. And Houdini really, the amazing Randy has said that it's a lot easier to fool a bunch of scientists from SRI, Stanford Research Institute, than to fool a trained magician. So in any event, you're right. And in fact, after the seance, or the seances that he attended, that he sort of explained what her tricks were. For example, here she is. She made a table tip over, and you can see how she did it. She put her head underneath the table, or at one point, she released her hand momentarily to do something, and then later on, there was a megaphone in the room, and she said, where would you like the megaphone to be thrown? Even though both of her hands are being held, and somehow the megaphone was thrown because she put it on her head. And then she just whipped it over to wherever it was to go.
And this is all presumably being done in the dark.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. Yes, in the dark. And also she channeled her late brother, Walter. That was the sort of character who allegedly was performing all these manifestations. So, yes, after Houdini originally was part of the seance, he went back to wherever he was, presumably New York, and then learned that other members of the committee wanted to give her the prize. So thank you for making that point. I was going to get to it, but it was just at the right time. So what did he do? He returns to New York, but this time he constructs a box, which as you can see in the cover of his monograph. And it did have little holes in the sides, but it limited the ability to move your hands, and it also eliminated her being able to use her feet, and also she wouldn't be able to get out and tip the table over. So when she had that box, she was very, very limited in the spiritual manifestations that she could perform. Here is a booklet that came out later on about the whole episode. All right, so after that episode, Houdini certainly is no less adamant about his attitudes about debunking fraudulent spiritualists, to whom the list of whom Margery has been added to, I suppose. This is a contract from a speakers bureau. In 1924, Harry contracted to go around the country giving talks on this very topic, on spiritualism, on bogus spiritualists. And he would get up and rail against spiritualists, again, bogus spiritualists. I think it's important, that he always said that he remained open to the possibility that there was a way to communicate with the deceased, but he hadn't yet found someone who could do it with other than bogus means. So I think that's a true skeptic, as you sort of his mindset and the way he looked at it was in a very logical, skeptical way. It wasn't in a closed-minded way, I don't believe. I sort of like the contract is mostly just boilerplate about this, who's going to pay for what. But I like it at the top. You get sort of Houdini's old world sensibility. As he wrote in all billing matter, posters, etc. I object to the use of the words hokum and fakery. They are too vulgar. Houdini. So in the lectures, he would, as I say, he would talk about his experiences with people like Margery. He would demonstrate the methods of fake spiritualists, like here he is with Bess, and they're switching slates. Slates were a commonly used object with chalk, with a message from the spirits would suddenly appear. Yeah, in every town he appeared in, he would research the local spiritualists when he gave these talks. So he would not mince words, and he would talk about specific people who were, in his view, bilking the public. And he would invite them to come to the show or come to the lecture and try to create some sort of phenomenon, which of course rarely happened. This is a report from Rose Mackerly to Houdini. Rose Mackerly was an investigator who he used, and he as well as other investigators. And when he was in a town, what's that?
Mackenberg.
I'm sorry. Mackenberg. Oh, that's what I said, right? No, I said Mackerly. Okay, my bad. Rose Mackenberg, and so it's a report of a sitting that she had with a spiritualist, and it has all the details. It has the address. The one is in Allston, Massachusetts, and it goes through all the various things that she said to Mackenberg about her late husband and the spirit of her baby and all things like that. And in the sitting was $1. Anyway, so you can see Houdini was really doing his research with the aid of these people like Mackenberg and other researchers. There was also a downside to all this. He was being sued in a number of cases by spiritualists for defamation. Here is a summoning Harry Houdini. Again, this is all in April 1926. This is a case in Chicago. Here is a letter to his good friend Joseph Dunninger, the mentalist, where he says, I'm being sued for $1 million, and these suits are no jokes. They are all very important, and to lose one means to lose all. So he actually, these spiritualists were quite litigious. This is a talk that he's given, Can the Dead Speak to the Living? This is in Houston, Texas, at the CIA auditorium. This is a handbill for a talk. I don't know what town this is in, at the White Theater. Don't know where that is. Here he's giving a talk to the ministers of New York at Keith's Hippodrome Theater. And keep in mind that Houdini was one of the most highest paid entertainers of his generation, and he didn't have to be doing this. He could have been packing theaters and not doing these lectures where sometimes they would go on for hours, longer than originally scheduled. So, for example, at his performance for the Ministers of New York, Houdini will expose, it says, this is the other side of that handbill, many of the deceptions such as so-called spirit, slate writing, bell ringing, table moving, and other things. He will answer any rational questions on the subject. And this is, he was still performing at some point during that period. This is a program, I believe 1926. If not, it's close to it. So it's during this time, mid-1920s, and you can see what the focus is. Now, I'm not sure if it's, one should be, it says beware. Should we beware of the spiritualists, or should the spiritualists beware of Houdini? This is the back cover where his $10,000 challenge to any medium in the world is referenced. So just to give you an idea of the extent to which spiritualism or debunking spiritualists was an important part of his life. This is his letter to Will Goldston, March 1926. My dear Will Goldston, thank you for your letter, also for the circular regarding the activities of the Magicians Club. He and Goldston had started the Magicians Club of London, and Goldston it was the president. You don't know how anxious I am to come over. Note you are having a night, magicians versus psychical researchers. Certainly would have liked to be present. The Harvard professors are now in my class. They are all being called liars by Margery. Spoke in Washington before the senators regarding a fortune-telling bill. Mediums here are using the cloak of religion to tell fortunes, and I'm trying to get a bill passed to prevent this. We'll keep you posted. Indeed, as discussed earlier, he did testify before Congress in support of a bill that would make it a crime for fortune tellers and spiritualists to pretend to tell fortunes for money. It would make it a misdemeanor. And it failed to pass. I think, in all fairness, it probably had some First Amendment issues, given the overlap, arguably, with religion. In 1926, he wrote an open letter to Calvin Coolidge in response to a petition that was being circulated by practitioners of spiritualism who consider themselves a persecuted group, in fact, likening themselves to a religion. Houdini devised his own petition to the president imploring Silent Cal to reject the claims of persecution advocated by the mediums. And I'm near the end of my talk, but I want to read you his closing comments, which I think capture Houdini's mixed feeling about his sort of ambivalence about spiritualism. That is, his intense dislike, a disdain for people who were bilking the public through fraudulent means, but at the same time, his openness and hope, perhaps, that he could, that somehow, somewhere there was someone who wasn't a faker. So let me read this from the last page of that, and I think you'll like how he refers to President Coolidge, which again sort of shows his old world sensibility. In conclusion, I trust most earnestly that, Your Excellency, if perchance you have not had the opportunity to make a personal study of this complicated and difficult subject, will not be influenced by the spiritualistic practitioners, and that you will not suppose that there is any, quote, religious persecution or any reason for modifying the entirely just laws which make it a crime for charlatans to rob and cheat grief-stricken people with alleged messages from the dead. I'm not actuated by prejudice or ill feeling in making this appeal. I do not consider it a victory to have found only error where I had hoped to find truth. My experience has been a keen disappointment. In August 1926, Margery was still giving seances, and she, or Walter, her brother, who spoke through her, predicted or threatened that Houdini would be dead by Halloween. Not the first of such threats. Sadly, the prediction would turn out to be eerily prescient. Performing in Detroit, he accepted an invitation to speak to students at McGill University across the Great Lake. He gave a talk, and in a freakish incident, after the talk, he was looking at mail, going through fan letters, and a McGill student said, "Mr. Houdini, is it true that you are in such good physical shape that you can withstand a blow to your abdomen?" And he said, he wasn't really paying attention. He said, "Yeah, sure, whatever." And this kid, who, according to some writers, was a boxer, punched him pretty hard in the abdomen. And that got Houdini's attention, and he reeled back and he said, "Okay, I didn't have a chance to tense up. Do it again." Later on, he felt ill, and he started running a fever. And with the attitude that the show must go on, he deferred medical care, probably until it was too late. And by the time he was at the Mercy Hospital in Detroit, they had determined that his appendix had ruptured and that he was dying of peritonitis. Those were back in the days when they didn't have the antibiotics that they have today. He was extremely ill, and for days he valiantly fought the disease that was killing him. Anyway, he hung on, and he died on Halloween. And to this day, magicians, every Halloween, have seances, and they try to contact Houdini. And the Halloween is National Magic Day for the magic organizations. We may never know whether that punch really caused his appendix to rupture, or whether it was about to rupture and somehow he was susceptible, or whether it aggravated the condition. But that's the story that's been told and retold. But he did die from a ruptured appendix. This is actually an obituary from the Jewish Forward, which was the leading Yiddish newspaper at that time. And on the upper right-hand quadrant, just before where it tells you who to vote for, there's a picture of Harry. You see, right next to Benito Mussolini. There he is. And here's an article that I think was in the Appleton newspaper. And it sort of brings it all full circle, because we all know about his fondness for apple pie, and his also being the bane of mediums. So after he died in 1926, in 1927, a year later, Bess, his wife, held a seance, and they attempted to make contact. They were not successful, and they tried it again for the next 9 years until 1936, when she announced, "Harry, I will turn out the light." And that was the last time that Bess, at least in a public seance, attempted to contact her husband. So Eric Weiss, known as Harry Houdini, came to his final rest in the family plot in the Machpelah Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. As requested in his will, he was buried with a pillow filled with his mother's letters beneath his head in the coffin. And it's said that on a summer night when the wind is still, that one can hear the rustling of paper near his gravesite. Thank you.